Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Ms. Carmela Monk-Crawford, who's the editor of Message magazine. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, the editor of Liberty magazine. We have Ms. Melissa Reid, who's the director of government affairs for the North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who is the general counsel and director of public affairs and religious liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, it is a pleasure to have you here with us. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. You know, there are a number of people who talk about religious freedom from a worldwide basis, and they come to the conclusion that the state of religious liberty in the world is dire. The U.S. House lawmakers recently called together some meetings and started talking about concerns that are taking place from a global standpoint, whether it's China or Nicaragua. There are issues regarding global health. There are issues regarding global human rights. There are issues regarding international organizations that are simply talking about there is something that needs to happen on a worldwide basis. However, lots of times Americans are not that concerned. We think that things basically are okay as long as it's okay in our own neighborhood. But billions of people around the world and nearly 70% of the world's population do not have the right to serve their God or to express their faith freely in whatever way they see fit. You know, Bettina, when we think about all these activities going around the world and the fact that the world itself talks so much about religious freedom, we're realizing that maybe our world and even the United States may be turning a lot more secular from a thought process than necessarily focused on religious freedom. How do we try to juxtapose that, in particular thinking about the fact that sometimes these things start creeping into our own communities, even here in the United States?
You're absolutely right, Orlin. I mean, there is this the trend that's taking place around the world. I mean, and it's a trend that is hard to explain because the majority of countries of the world have constitutions that explicitly protect religious freedom. It's right there in the constitutions, and yet you have organizations that track religious persecution around the world, and they all agree that some 70% of the world's population lives with very, very high restrictions on religious freedom. So what's happening here? What are the forces that are causing this disconnect? Well, part of it is the fact that in many countries, majority religion has its thumb on the scale. Mm-hmm. It is favored by the government and also ideologies. I mean, look at communist China. And so when you have that sort of majority dynamic happening, you are more likely to have a situation where religious minorities are bearing the brunt of either laws that discriminate against them or social hostility against them. And, you know, even the US is not immune from that dynamic.
You know, Orlin, that was what stood out to me as well, too, as far as it is the power dynamics that are at play here. It's not a particular religion. It's not even a particular region of the world or even a particular government system. If you look across, you know, you mentioned Nigeria, Nicaragua, China, and then we're talking about, you know, persecution that's occurring to a religion in one place and being the perpetrator in another place, or, you know, it's the government actor that's the overreach. And so there's a real diversity of the ways that this persecution or discrimination is taking place around the world. Unfortunately, as Bettina said, it's really a situation of those in power taking advantage rather than seeing it as a responsibility to minority population groups. They're seeing it as a way to take advantage of that power dynamic.
You know, one thing that stuck out to me is what Bettina said, as far as many countries have protections on the books, right? They might have laws that show that they believe in freedom of religion, but in practice, this is not what we're seeing. And for example, in Nigeria, right, where they have robust protections on the books, but you can still see that society is not honoring that. We have extremist groups that are targeting, Christians and on the other side as well. And so having laws in place, while it's great, is not enough to really protect religion and especially religious minorities.
I was just going to say, it's not enough for us to point out the perpetrators. There has to be consequences, right? And I think that was one of the reasons for the hearing is that Congress was frustrated because the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, even the State Department, point out these countries of particular concern, but then they sometimes ultimately do not even make the list, or there are no repercussions for their violations because of other interests, whether they be economic or things like that. And so it's not enough simply to identify or to have the appropriate legislation. It's that it's enacted and enforced.
Year after year, there's just the report that comes out, and it does list the countries, with particular concern, but it's what's the impact, right? Like simply calling out these countries, it seems like it's not enough. And so what else should be done? What else can be done?
Carmela, the question that I have in my mind, though, is for some reason, there's a large part of society that thinks that the way that you make an impact is to go in and destroy houses of worship. We're talking about Boko Haram that's deciding that they wanted to, come in and engage in activities that may be a problem. And, Boko Haram in Nigeria is going in and deciding, let's destroy mosques, let's destroy churches. The U.S. has just recently had to put something out that talked about how do we protect synagogues and protect Jewish people. What is this societal, terrible discord and idea that the main way I impact you is to try to damage where you worship? What is that all about?
Well, unfortunately, I'm hearing what you're saying, and none of this should be a surprise to any of us. These headlines, I guess, sort of signal what we have seen, the long, slow decline in civility and respect among humanity. And, I just watched I think it was on 60 Minutes very recently, regarding how there are so many of the traditional houses of worship in which not only the beautiful houses of worship, the center of community, but so much of the culture with the beautiful artifacts and artistic pieces being destroyed after hundreds and hundreds of years. The sad thing is this is about just a lack of humanity as we get to the point, the civil discourse, political discourse, religious respect and freedom. I hit you where it hurts. And that's where we are today. I don't know what the answer is. There's plenty of more people more highly esteemed than I. And even the panelists here today have said, you've got laws on the books. The question is, what do we do and how do we model a certain style of civility in today's fever pitch?
No, and I think I'm going where you probably were taking the conversation as well. What has struck me as I've listened to all our panelists talking is that there is a real disconnect between how we define religious persecution here in the US and the reality of religious persecution in some of the other countries, as Jennifer said, in Nigeria, for instance, and in other places of the world where houses of worship are being closed, people are being imprisoned, where you cannot practice your faith in a way that's open. And yet we're increasingly seeing the word persecution being thrown around in domestic settings. And I think we need to be careful that we don't get too loose with that word, because what we're experiencing in America are discussions and debates, sometimes not very civil, but there's still a high level of religious freedom protection here in the US. And if we need to, put it all in perspective, we should read the international news more often.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying, Bettina. On the other hand, I think if we look specifically to the growth in anti-Semitism here in the United States, in the
Right.
last few years. I think that is unfortunately a little asterisk to sort of what other faith traditions are experiencing here in the United States. It was interesting. I was just reading, thinking about this conversation we were going to have, and I read a really good opinion piece in Newsweek from the beginning of the month from a lawyer with First Liberty, and then a rabbi from a Jewish organization, and the title of the piece was "Religious Liberty Stops Violence," and it was really bringing in something or honing in on something that we talk about all the time, as far as there has to be those stopgaps in place in order for things not to get to a violent sort of escalation or level. And it has to be something that's respected by and admired and supported by the broader community. But yeah, I think it's really unfortunate. The data that I was looking at for the anti-Semitism here in the United States was from 2022. And those numbers were more than double than any other religious population group in 2022. I can only imagine what it is in this year.
Well, Jennifer, what's interesting is that when you take a look at what's going on in this arena, you almost can go back to COVID to kind of figure out what a society actually thinks of itself when it's in trauma. And for some reason, houses of worship were not considered to be essential services, but liquor stores, gaming operations, baseball games were all considered to be things that people had to make sure you had a way to connect with it. When you live in a society where making sure a liquor store is open, but making sure churches are closed in the midst of a pandemic, I think that's already kind of making a statement of what society really thinks, and no one really complained about it. And so that to me almost is a statement of where we seem to be and maybe where we're continuing to go.
And that's unfortunate. And I think that many of us, we take it for granted, religious liberty, religious freedom. And what we're seeing is just how fragile it is, right? How quickly a group can be targeted, how quickly it can go from just an inconvenience to actual persecution for some, even within our society here in the US. And so we do have to be mindful of the role that religious institutions play, the role that religion plays, and to be mindful of respecting freedom of religion, because it can turn so quickly if we don't protect that basic human right.
This is such a nuanced conversation, and I really like when we're able to have the conversation more on a more global level, because as Bettina mentioned, it is so strikingly different what religious freedom looks like in an international context that it does here in the United States. Again, we have challenges here living in the United States, but we are certainly blessed as far as our religious freedom protections.
And I think that's exactly where I think we kind of wrap this up, with the idea that we are blessed here in the U.S., but we still live in a world where injustice for one is really injustice for all. And what's happening in somebody else's backyard could show up in my own. So the ability to go out and be willing to make these statements from a global perspective, I think helps us to be a better country and hopefully a better worldwide leader. There's still so many issues that seem to go on in the area of education as it relates to religious freedom. There's a case that's called Lojfman versus California Department of Education. And Congress had passed basically a piece of legislation that was called the Disabilities Education Act, which is to help parents and their children with disabilities to obtain equal educational opportunities as they have been, in contrast to non-disabled peers. But the problem that we see is that this particular act has sometimes come back, in particular in California, and also wanted to be clear that some of the programs that may be available should not have access to religious organizations. Now, you would have thought that this would have been something that we have already gone down the road and understood, that if you're making something available for one group in a society, that just because you have a religious connection, that should still be the same. But it looks like we still have California politicians in particular that are punishing religious parents, their children, and religious schools who would gladly accept some of the benefits that come from having these disabilities. I'm not sure how we get to a point where we can actually start making clear that this is not the right thing, or maybe society is trying to tell us that they have a completely different point of view on there. You know, Jennifer, as you look at this piece of legislation and think about how it impacts us from a domestic standpoint, and even the way some of these things end up, exploding internationally, how do we kind of deal with this issue as it relates to academics and religious freedom?
Orlando, I think it was interesting because when I read through this, I said, well, wasn't this already taken care of in the Carson case to some extent? And, you talk about is society saying that they don't want funds to go to, religious schools. It looks like, at least in California, that the public there, by 60%, they want parents of children to be able to access schools regardless of whether they are religious or non-religious. And so I find it a little bit perplexing as well. It seems to me that we've already addressed this issue and that the courts at least have been clear at the Supreme Court level that if we're going to offer a benefit and extend it beyond public education, then you should not be disqualified just because you're a religious institution.
So, and Jennifer, I agree with you that the Supreme Court has dealt with the constitutionality of whether religious schools can participate in the same programs as non-religious schools. With the line of cases starting in 2017 right through to 2022 with Carson versus Macon, they've made it very clear that at a federal level, this is the situation. However, there are, I believe, public policy implications to the idea that the state can open up its funding coffers in an unrestrained manner to religious schools or to religious enterprises. I mean, you see what's happening in Oklahoma at the moment, where the nation's very first religious charter school has been voted into existence. That's a fully funded Catholic, fully state-funded Catholic charter school. Do we as a society want to go down that route when for many, many decades before 2017, we made it clear that there was this strong line between what the government can legitimately fund when it comes to religious institutions? And I know this discussion is going to move forward in this group, but I just want to say these restrictions on funding to religious schools isn't about punishing religion. It's protective of religion in the long term to keep that separation between church and state so that government is not establishing or favoring one religion over another.
Mm-hmm. And Melissa, I think that's the real question here. When you start looking at, part of the reason that individuals may, quote unquote, decide to send their students to a public school or to a private school is with another specific intent in mind. And the idea of resources and how they get parsed in order to use them for parochial institutions as well as public institutions seem to still be causing some confusion. And maybe the reality is it should be a state-by-state concept as opposed to one that we think will cut across, all 50 of our states. Or is that going a little too far? I'm not sure.
Yeah. I have a hard time with this case because obviously we're very sympathetic to children with disabilities and their parents who are, it's already tough enough to try to find appropriate education for an individual. And then you put in the special needs component as well. And then you have a piece of federal legislation which does not differentiate between religious private schools and secular private schools as far as whether or not they're eligible. But then California, this particular state, has decided to take that additional initiative. It's tough to not see that as discriminatory. I completely understand what Bettina says and agree with as far as most of the time when we're looking at these sort of situations, it is in fact to protect the religious identity or the faith identity of an institution. But honestly, I'm just having a hard time recognizing that as what's happening in the state of California with this situation.
You know, and I think, Carmela, when you think about what goes on in a lot of these, arguments regarding do you utilize funds for religious organizations or not, is this a question that should be stepping back and thinking about what's in the best interest of children in this particular society or in this particular concentric circle that we're talking about here? Or is it the more you start creeping in that direction, the more you start merging this whole concept of church and state, and then it almost feeds into some of the dialogue you're even hearing from people who are in the political campaign right now. Let's just put it back all together. Let's do it this way. Everybody will be better off when it's all said and done. Maybe that's not so bad an argument.
I think it is a bad argument from my perspective, Orland. And I agree with you in one sense, is that every little nuance makes this more and more confusing. People of conscience, you have, there are certain principles there, but this is starting to get like the tax code. You don't know what exemption applies. You don't know what scenario this applies to. And I don't think that we could safely say that the public actually wants this. I don't think people know. People know we have the constitutional right to worship and freedom of worship, but all of these different nuances about what the state can offer to a certain individual or what program the state can support or send certain programming and services through, that's very difficult for most people to understand. And I do think we're going down that road. And we do know that there are people who truly believe that there is no separation of church and state, and that was never the intent of the framers. And so they are able to hide behind children with disabilities and any other programs that are very sympathetic.
And I think, Carmela, you raise the last thing you said about the wall of separation, or the separation of church and state, going back to something that Bettina said, this is to protect that separation. I think that there's also, some responsibility, especially when it comes to government programs, on the institutions themselves, on the religious institutions, to make sure that when they're accepting funding or when they're participating in these programs, that they're also being mindful that it protects them to have some kind of wall of separation, right? And this is where the nuance becomes important. What is the funding? What are the strings attached to the funding? What are the expectations by accepting certain funding? So I think that it really does depend in some instances on the program and what an institution is willing to accept along with that funding.
Well, I was just going to say, I agree with that too. And I think that's an important distinction, because we're talking, I know a lot of times courts have looked to, well, is the funding going towards furthering the religious education component, or is it just sort of generally applicable to whether, school upkeep or accommodating, children with disabilities sort of thing. So I appreciate that nuance there, Jennifer.
I agree with Jennifer too. I mean, that whole strings attached is an important issue when it comes to protecting religious identity. But, just to make it a little bit more complex, I don't want to minimize the concern of many parents in America today who feel that the public schools themselves are not religiously or ideologically neutral. I mean, and this, I think, is at the base of all the sort of controversy and discussion that we're having here today about the nuances of legislation and what have you. At its core, we have a lack of trust in our public school system on the part of religiously affiliated parents, that those schools are going to treat their children in a neutral way and not sort of push an anti-religion message. So that's the deeper discussion that perhaps we need to have, apart from all these discussions about how our Constitution and different pieces of legislation work.
Well, some of the irony of this, Carmela, is that sometimes as soon as public funds are available, secular society thinks that religious organizations are almost running them over to get to the front of the line. The idea is that, okay, you want it to be kind of separate because you wanted things to go a certain way, but drop some federal dollars, kind of out in the middle of the square and see who gets there first. And first, second, or third, really close seems to be religious institutions, charging ahead for these type of fundings. And I think that's also creating part of the issue that we're seeing is that, wait wait a second. I thought this is supposed to be separate. What about the protections that we wanted in place? But as soon as funds are available, it looks like, sometimes running over to get to the front of the line, which doesn't have the same feel as what I think we were thinking about with religious institutions wanting to be set apart in some way.
You paint a very vivid word picture, because I can see our institutions, many institutions, running for that crust of bread and running back inside and behind closed doors and saying, now leave me alone. Don't bother me. Don't interfere with what we're doing and how we're doing it. I think we all have to take a long, hard look at just how we're doing business. And the public requires, that's why a nonprofit organization, it has the public trust. And there's certain things that the public needs us to operate, or certain, I should say, structures and certain, guardrails that we operate within. And so those things still have to be there. And just because you want the money, you can't get away from the oversight.
I'm going to let that be the last word, Carmela, but it seems as though that's one of the things that we have to get comfortable with, that sometimes being set apart means you have to leave certain things on the table. And how do you find the right balance to make sure that you're already looking out for the right group of people and not being excluded because of your religion, but not really start finding ourselves running to the front of the line just because it looks like something's available? This is something we'll have to continue to talk about in the future. Hey, Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. Well, Orlin, we mentioned the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom at the top of the show. I don't know if you know or not, but they maintain a database of religion, of freedom of religion or belief victims list. And it's searchable by abuse type, by perpetrator, and by faith tradition. And I think it's a very useful, obviously very sobering tool, but it helps put individual faces on a very pressing human rights concern.
Wow, didn't know that at all. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, something that I didn't know until recently is that there's a growing trend among the religiously unaffiliated, also known as the nuns, to attend secular, atheist, or psychedelic churches. So that was new to me.
Wow, didn't know about that either. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So we've just been talking about education in California. Did you know, Orlin, that a county in California just a few years back became the first to completely eliminate chairs from elementary school classrooms, made the students stand up, and surprise, it actually helped with classroom behavior because it helped burn off energy. So I'm thinking we should implement that in a few workplaces.
Wow, sounds like law school. Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
I have a lot of things that I don't know, Orlin, today. I think in light of our conversation today, I think it's very interesting to take a look at what people really believe as religious freedom. Take a look at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, their polling on data on what people hold dear as religious freedom.
That's very, very interesting. Ladies, I appreciate our conversation today. I know these are topics we're probably going to have to deal with moving forward as well. Thanks again for being here with us today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.